You finished the plate in 6 minutes. The fork never stopped moving. The last bite was swallowed before the first bite had reached the small intestine. 20 minutes later, the fullness arrived. The plate was already empty, and the second serving was halfway done. The overeating was a signal delay problem, not willpower. Latency. The gut sends a stop signal to the brain through hormones that take 15 to 20 minutes to reach the processing center that suppresses appetite. You finished in 6 minutes. The signal arrived at the end of the hormone delay. You ate for the entire delay window past a stop sign that was still in transit. The speed of the fork outran the speed of the hormones. And the overeating is the smallest problem because the particles that reached the small intestine were too large for the enzymes to process. The stomach acid that should have been waiting was not ready, and the nutrients you thought you consumed passed through without ever crossing the intestinal wall. 5 systems, each independently altered by one variable, time. 5 systems changed by one variable, same food, same calories, different speed. Why does the stop signal take so long? 3 hormones carry the satiety message. Cholecystokinin, released from cells in the duodenal lining when fat and protein from the meal arrive. Peptide Y, released from cells in the lower small intestine when nutrients progress further along the tract. Glucagon-like peptide 1, released from cells in the lower small intestine and colon as digestion advances distally. Glucagon-like peptide 1 serves a dual role. It signals satiety to the hypothalamus through the bloodstream, and it simultaneously acts as an incretin on the pancreatic beta cells, amplifying insulin release in proportion to the glucose load arriving in the duodenum. Faster eating produces a sharper glucose wave, which triggers a sharper incretin response, which produces a larger insulin overshoot, which drives the reactive glucose dip that crashes the afternoon energy. Each hormone enters the portal vein, passes through the liver, enters the systemic circulation, crosses to the brain, and binds receptors on appetite-regulating neurons in the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus. The neurons that register the hormone activate a suppression pathway that reduces the drive to eat. Architectural delay, not a design flaw. The sensor sits in the gut. The processor sits in the brain. The messenger travels through the bloodstream, passing through the portal circulation, the liver, the heart, and the systemic arterial network, before reaching the hypothalamic neurons that process the signal. 15 to 20 minutes from the moment fat and protein contact the duodenal lining to the moment the hypothalamus registers the concentration change and the appetite suppression begins. A compressed meal delivers its full caloric load 14 minutes before the first cholecystokinin molecules reach the hypothalamus. The brain receives a post-meal report, a notification that arrives after the event it was supposed to regulate. A 25-minute meal allows the signal to arrive at minute 15 or 20, with 60 to 80% of the meal consumed and the remaining portion modulated by the arriving hormones. The slow eater's brain participates in the meal, adjusting intake in real time as the hormones arrive and the appetite suppression pathway activates. By minute 18, the drive to continue eating has diminished measurably. The fork slows. The bites get smaller. The meal tapers naturally toward a stopping point. The hormones are actively setting. The fast eater's brain reviews the aftermath. The meal ended before the signal departed. The hormones arrive at minute 20. The suppression pathway activates into an empty plate. The signal that would have modulated the final 30% of the meal arrives to find no meal remaining to modulate. The overconsumption happened in the dead zone between the meal's end and the signal's arrival, and no amount of discipline can override a signal that has not yet arrived. Eating speed determines whether the satiety feedback loop closes during the meal or after it. Subjects eating identical meals at different speeds showed significantly different gut hormone profiles, with slower eating producing earlier and higher peak concentrations of peptide Y and glucagon-like peptide 1. Kokkinos and colleagues measured this in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. The hormones arrived in time only when the meal lasted long enough for the loop to close. Driving a car where the speedometer updates on a 20-minute delay. You have been accelerating for 19 minutes with no reading. The number appears. You were going twice the speed you intended. The delay between the input and the feedback made the overshoot inevitable. You cannot drive safely with a long delay on your speed reading, and you cannot eat accurately with the same delay on your phonus reading. The gut speedometer updates on the hormone delay. The compressed meal finished before the first reading arrived. Every calorie consumed between the meal's end and the signal's arrival was consumed without feedback, in the blind zone between the meal's end and the signal's arrival. Well, the feedback loop delay reframed the second serving I had been blaming on willpower. The plate was already empty. The hormones that would have told me to stop were still in the portal vein, passing through the liver, nowhere near the hypothalamus. The second serving happened in the 14-minute window between the meal and the signal. The willpower was irrelevant. The information had not arrived. Signal arrived late. The stop signal is not the only system that needs time. The stomach was supposed to prepare for the food before it arrived, and the fasted had denied it, the preparation window. What happens when food arrives before the stomach is ready? Cephalic phase. Before the first bite reaches the stomach, the brain starts digestion based on sensory prediction. Sight and smell of food activate neurons in the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, which sends parasympathetic signals down the vagus nerve to two cell populations in the stomach wall. Parietal cells receive the signal and begin secreting hydrochloric acid. Chief cells receive it and begin secreting pepsinogen, the inactive precursor that acid converts into pepsin, the protein-cleaving enzyme. The two-step preparation, acid from the parietal cells and enzyme from the chief cells, takes 3 to 5 minutes of sustained sensory input to reach full secretory capacity. The stomach lining releases gastrin to amplify and sustain the response. A meal prepared at home, served at a table, eaten over 25 minutes with no screen, the cephalic phase runs to completion. The stomach is acidified, enzyme loaded, and ready for each bolus as it arrives. The acid denatures the protein, unfolding the three-dimensional structure of each protein molecule to expose the peptide bonds that enzymes need to access in order to cleave the chain into absorbable fragments. The unfolding takes time. The acid must contact the protein's surface, penetrate the folds, and break the bonds that hold the tertiary structure in its native shape. A properly acidified stomach completes this denaturation before the food passes into the duodenum. A meal grabbed standing, eaten in the car, finished in 5 minutes, the cephalic phase fired weakly. Minimal acid ready, minimal enzyme ready. The food arrives onto an unprepared surface. The protein passes through the stomach partially folded, the three-dimensional structure still intact, the peptide bonds still buried inside the protein's core, where the enzymes cannot reach them. The partially denatured protein enters the small intestine as larger fragments that the pancreatic enzymes must work harder and longer to cleave, because the upstream acid processing that should have prepared the substrate was skipped. Fat absorption suffers through a parallel mechanism. Cholecystokinin, the same hormone that carries the satiety signal, also triggers bile release from the gallbladder. A truncated cephalic phase produces less cholecystokinin, which produces less bile secretion, which means fewer bile salt molecules available to emulsify the dietary fat into micelles small enough for the intestinal wall to absorb. The meals discussion described cholecystokinin suppressing motilin and resetting the cleaning wave. Here, cholecystokinin serves a second function, preparing the bile the fat needs to be absorbed. Fast eating weakens both functions simultaneously. The fat passes through partially emulsified, carrying fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K dissolved in the fat the body could not absorb because the bile preparation was truncated by the eating speed. The vitamin loss is invisible. The fat in the stool is invisible unless it reaches the concentration that produces the pale, malodorous stool clinicians recognize. The eating speed determined the bile quantity determined the micelle formation, and the micelle formation determined whether the fat-soluble nutrients crossed the intestinal wall or passed through. Distracted eater compounds the problem. The cephalic phase requires attention. The visual and olfactory signals that drive the vagal preparation compete with whatever the screen is displaying. Eating while scrolling suppresses the cephalic phase because the neural resources that would process the food's appearance and aroma are processing the phone's content instead. The vagal signal that drives gastric preparation depends on sensory engagement with the food, the smell reaching the olfactory bulb and triggering the dorsal motor nucleus, the appearance registering in the visual cortex and feeding forward to the same vagal output, the first chewing motions activating the mechanoreceptors in the jaw that confirm food has arrived and the preparation should intensify. Each input contributes to the vagal output. Each input competed away by the screen reduces the vagal signal. The stomach receives the food without the preparation that the brain would have initiated if the brain had been paying attention to the meal instead of the screen. The consequence is measurable: lower acid concentration, lower enzyme secretion, and a stomach environment that processes the arriving food less effectively than it would have with 5 minutes of attentional engagement before the first bite. Cephalic phase responses during eating depend on attentional engagement with the meal. Sensory anticipation of food drives measurable increases in gastric acid and enzyme secretion, with the magnitude correlating to the duration of sensory input. Smeets and colleagues documented this in Appetite. Stomach was not ready, the acid was insufficient, the protein was not fully denatured, and the particles that survive the stomach arrive in the small intestine at a size the enzymes were never designed to process, because the chewing that should have multiplied their working surface was cut short. How does chewing change what the enzymes can reach? Enzymatic digestion is a surface phenomenon. Enzymes bind to particle surfaces. They cannot penetrate interiors. The rate of digestion is proportional to the total available surface area, not the total food volume. One food particle, 1 centimeter in diameter, has a surface area of approximately 3.14 square centimeters. Cut it in half, 2 pieces, with a combined surface area of approximately 4.71 square centimeters, a 50% increase. Cut each half again, 4 pieces with approximately 6.28 square centimeters, double the original. Continue subdividing. By the time thorough chewing reduces a 1 centimeter particle to 1 millimeter fragments, the total enzyme contact surface has increased approximately tenfold, 10 times the working surface for enzymes to bind. Same food volume, same caloric content. 10 times more accessible substrate. The enzyme concentration the pancreas secretes is the same regardless of particle size. The transit time through the small intestine is the same, approximately 3 to 5 hours for most meals. The only variable that changed was the accessible geometry the enzymes could bind. At tenfold more surface, each enzyme molecule encounters its substrate faster, cleaves more bonds per hour, and liberates more absorbable nutrients before the transit time expires and the undigested remainder exits the small intestine into the colon. Fast eater, 5 to 8 chews per bite. Slow eater, 20 to 30 chews per bite. The particle size entering the stomach differs by a factor of 3 to 5. The enzyme working surface differs correspondingly. The fast eater's digestive enzymes encounter a fraction of the accessible substrate the slow eater's enzymes reach, operating on the same enzyme concentration in the same transit time with dramatically less surface to work on. Mathematics is the geometry of spheres and the chemistry of enzyme kinetics. Mastication and nutrient bioavailability follow this relationship through measurable absorption differences. Increasing the number of chewing cycles before swallowing increases the bioavailability of nutrients from identical food. Carl and colleagues established this in Food Quality and Preference. Undigested centers of large particles transit the small intestine intact. Amino acids, fatty acids, glucose, and micronutrients locked inside a protein or starch matrix the enzymes never reached because the working area was never exposed. You consumed the food, you chewed it 8 times. The outer layer was digested, the interior passed through. The body absorbed a fraction of what the plate contained. The small intestine has approximately 3 to 5 hours to extract nutrients from each meal before peristalsis moves the material into the colon. The transit time is fixed. The enzyme concentration is fixed. The only variable the eater controls is the enzyme contact surface the enzymes can access during that fixed window. Thorough chewing maximizes the accessible geometry, giving the fixed enzyme concentration its maximum working surface during the fixed transit time. Minimal chewing minimizes the working area, and the fixed enzymes working on the reduced surface during the fixed transit time liberate a fraction of the available nutrients before the transit window closes and the colon receives the remainder. I saw my own chewing differently the week the enzyme contact surface mathematics became specific. 8 chews producing 3 square centimeters of working surface. 25 chews producing 12 to 15. The enzymes were identical. The transit time was identical. The difference was the accessible geometry, and I had been giving my enzymes a fraction of the surface they needed for 30 years of meals eaten in under 10 minutes. 3 systems, each independently compromised by eating speed, each producing its own consequence from the same behavioral input. The signal arrived late, the preparation was skipped, and the particles were too large. Where does the undigested food go? Food that passed through the small intestine undigested does not disappear. It arrives in the colon, where a different biological community is waiting for it. And what they produce from it is what you experience 2 to 4 hours later. What does the colon do with food the small intestine could not finish? Small intestine absorbs fully digested nutrients, single amino acids, simple sugars, individual fatty acids, vitamins, minerals. Each must be broken down to its smallest absorbable unit before the intestinal wall can transport it. The colon absorbs water and electrolytes. It was not designed to process complex nutrients. When large, partially digested particles bypass the small intestine, colonic bacteria ferment them. Bacteria possess enzymatic machinery that human cells lack, capable of breaking bonds the pancreatic enzymes could not reach, because the substrate arrived in particles too large for human enzymes to penetrate. The bacteria reach the interior by colonizing the particle surface and producing their own enzymes at close range over hours, slowly dismantling what the small intestine passed along, because the transit window closed before the human enzymes could finish. Protein fermentation, driven primarily by Bilophila and other sulfite-reducing bacteria, produces hydrogen sulfide, the distinctive rotten egg odor, along with branched-chain fatty acids and ammonia. Carbohydrate fermentation, driven primarily by bacteroids and Clostridium species, produces hydrogen gas. Methanogenic archaea in a subset of individuals convert the hydrogen to methane, which produces less odor but more distension because methane slows colonic transit. Whether your gas is predominantly hydrogen or methane depends on which microbial populations dominate your colon, a composition that varies between individuals and explains why two people eating identical meals at identical speeds may experience different gas profiles from identical colonic substrate. The bloating, the distension, the flatulence that arrives 2 to 4 hours after the meal. The distension is real. Gas produced in the colon inflates a tube approximately 5 to 6 centimeters in diameter, and the colonic wall, innervated with stretch-sensitive neurons, registers the distension as cramping and discomfort. The volume of gas is proportional to the volume of undigested substrate that reached the colon, and the volume of undigested substrate is proportional to the particle size that determined how much the small intestine could absorb before the transit window closed. The timing is the diagnostic clue you can use on your own body. Gas arriving within 30 to 60 minutes of eating originates in the stomach or upper small intestine and usually relates to the food itself or to small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Gas arriving at the 2 to 4 hour mark originated in the colon, from material that should have been absorbed upstream but arrived downstream because the particle size sent it to the wrong processor. Bloating you attribute it to specific foods. The assumption that certain foods simply produce gas may have been partially a speed problem. The same food eaten slowly, chewed thoroughly, arriving in the small intestine as small particles with maximal accessible geometry, gets absorbed upstream. The same food eaten fast, chewed minimally, arriving as large particles with minimal working area, passes through the small intestine and reaches the colon where bacteria ferment it into gas. The food did not change. The speed changed. The location of processing changed, and the wrong location produced the byproducts. Colonic fermentation handled what the small intestine could not absorb. But the nutrients that did cross the intestinal wall, the glucose specifically, arrived in a pattern the eating speed also determined. How does eating speed change the glucose peak from identical food? Fast eating produces rapid gastric emptying. A large volume of partially chewed food dumps from the stomach into the small intestine in a compressed window. The glucose released from the food arrives at the intestinal absorption surface in a concentrated wave. The intestinal transporters absorb glucose at a rate proportional to the concentration in the intestinal lumen. High concentration arriving fast produces rapid absorption, a sharp spike in blood glucose, a large insulin response to clear the spike, and the reactive dip below baseline at 90 to 120 minutes. The post-meal energy crash you blamed on the food. The crash is real. Blood glucose dropping below the pre-meal baseline produces measurable fatigue, difficulty concentrating, irritability, and the craving for another carbohydrate source that would spike the glucose back up. The cycle of spike, crash, crave, spike runs on a 90 to 120 minute loop, driven entirely by how fast the initial meal delivered its glucose to the intestinal absorption surface. Slow eating produces gradual gastric emptying. Smaller, well-chewed boluses pass from the stomach to the small intestine in distributed pulses across 25 to 30 minutes. Lower glucose concentration at the brush border at any given moment. A lower, wider glucose curve. A proportional insulin response matched to the gradual absorption. No reactive dip. No crash. No mid-afternoon energy collapse that drives the next snack or the next coffee. The eating speed determined the glucose shape. The glucose shape determined the insulin shape, and the insulin shape determined whether the afternoon felt stable or whether the energy crashed at 2 o'clock and you reached for a stimulus to compensate. Eating speed and glycemic response follow this relationship through measurable glucose curve differences from identical meals. Increased chewing time produced lower postprandial glucose peaks from identical food. Leibowitz and colleagues confirmed this in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And then the connection that ties fork speed to the chemistry. The postprandial discussion described operating on every irreplaceable protein in the body. The Maillard reaction rate, the glucose-driven cross-linking that stiffens the lens, the bladder wall, the arterial endothelium, and the valve leaflets, is proportional to glucose peak concentration. A higher peak means more glucose molecules colliding with more protein surfaces per unit time, forming more cross-links per meal. The same food eaten faster produces a higher peak, which drives a faster glycation rate, which accelerates the cross-linking on every tissue this chemistry reaches. Fork speed is upstream of the chemistry that ages the proteins the body cannot replace. The glucose curve carried different weight. The afternoon, the Maillard arithmetic connected fork speed to the cross-linking chemistry. A 20% higher peak from faster eating multiplied across 3 meals a day, 365 days a year, across 3 decades of adult eating. The fork was the most upstream variable I had never considered. The connection is quantitative. The proportionally higher glycation rate compounds across every postprandial window, accumulating additional crosslinks on the collagen of the lens, the endothelium of the arteries, the basement membrane of the kidney. Slowing the meal lowers the peak. Lowering the peak slows the cross-linking. Slowing the cross-linking delays the stiffening. The fork speed is the most upstream behavioral variable in the glycation cascade. 5 systems, each independently compromised by one variable, time. Now, why does the delay exist at all? Why did the body build a feedback loop with the hormone delay when a faster loop would prevent the overshoot? The delay matched the meal. Ancestral food, raw, fibrous, minimally processed, required sustained mastication. 30 to 45 minutes of chewing, tearing, grinding through that resisted the teeth at every bite. Raw root vegetables requiring sustained mastication to break through fibrous cell walls. Meat that had not been ground, tenderized, or processed into a form that dissolves on the tongue. Seeds and nuts with hard shells and dense interiors that demanded prolonged mechanical work before swallowing was physically possible. The food enforced the speed because the food resisted the teeth. The food was the rate limiter, and the hormones evolved to match that rate because no other rate existed in the environment the loop was calibrated for. The hormone delay arrived in the middle of a meal that was still in progress, with 40 to 60% consumed and the remaining portion modulated by the arriving signal. The loop closed during the meal because the meal lasted long enough for the loop to close. Modern processed food requires minimal chewing. A fast food meal consumed in 4 to 5 minutes. A sandwich in 3. The delay that was never a problem across 2 million years of hominid evolution became the primary driver of overconsumption within a single century. The feedback loop's latency exceeded the meal's duration for the first time in evolutionary history. The loop still runs at the speed it always has. The meal got faster than the loop was designed to accommodate. A raw carrot requires approximately 40 chews per mouthful. A piece of white bread requires approximately 10. A protein shake requires 0. The food industry engineered foods that require progressively less mastication, progressively less time in the mouth, progressively faster transit from plate to stomach. Each reduction in chewing time compressed the meal duration, widened the gap between the meal's end and the signal's arrival, and moved the feedback loop further from the operating range it was calibrated to fill. The food outran the loop. 15 to 20 minutes was never too slow. The loop was calibrated to a meal that took 30 to 45 minutes. The compressed meal is the anomaly. The loop is performing at the speed it was built for, inside a feeding environment it was never built for. 25 to 30 minutes per meal. Each bite chewed until it reaches a uniform paste, approximately 20 to 30 chews depending on the food's resistance. Fork placed on the table between bites, breaking the hand-to-mouth automation that drives continuous loading. Meals eaten without screens, because the cephalic phase requires the neural resources the phone competes for. Water between bites, allowing the stomach time to register the arriving volume and the cephalic acid secretion to maintain pace with the food. The changes are mechanical, not motivational. They require no new information about nutrition. They require no caloric restriction. They require no willpower beyond the decision to slow down. They change the speed at which identical food reaches the small intestine, and the speed determines the enzyme contact surface, the enzyme access, the glucose curve, the hormone timing, and the colonic gas production from a meal that was nutritionally identical at the caloric level. The test is 1 week. Eat every meal for 25 minutes. Compare the bloating, the energy stability, the afternoon crash, and the fullness timing against the previous week's pattern. The physics predicts the difference. The week confirms it. 5 systems, each independently altered by one variable: time. Same food. Same calories. Different speed. The fork outran the physiology. The physiology was designed for the speed the food once enforced. The food no longer enforces it. The fork must.